Welcome to Train Signal. This is the Configuring Threat Management Gateway URL Filtering lesson in the Forefront Threat Management Gateway 2010 training course. We'll start this lesson by talking about why it's important to link Threat Management Gateway to corporate policy and compliance needs. We'll move on to talk about some URL filtering licensing considerations, and then move on to a discussion about how URL filtering actually works and what it does. Next, you'll learn how to manage existing URL filters as well as overall URL filtering settings, and we'll wrap up the lesson with a discussion about enabling safe search integration with Threat Management Gateway. A layered security approach is always the best defense, and GlobalMantics understands this basic security concept. In addition to other tools in the infrastructure, GlobalMantics wants to deploy the URL filtering service so that they can control end-user access to specific websites and also protect the organization by denying access to known malicious sites that may harbor malware or inappropriate content. And this is all based on predefined URL categories. By the end of this lesson, GlobalMantics will understand how to protect the organization from potential malware as a part of the URL filtering service, although actual malware inspection is covered elsewhere in this course. They'll also know how to prevent users from visiting websites that defy corporate policy, and they'll understand the role of URL categories in the URL filtering service. And finally, you will understand the role that Microsoft's reputation service plays in the URL filtering communications stream. The most important step in any security system is to make sure that the environment is secure. Next to that is to make sure that the security policies that are in place are linked to overall corporate policy and regulatory compliance needs. Every security system has to balance two diametrically opposed forces. First of all, you have the need to secure your systems against internal and external threats and wasteful activities. This is the tolerance that an organization has for risk. Next, the other side of this coin is providing users access to the tools that they need to do their jobs. And this is directly related to productivity. The less that people can do without having to go through hoops to get it done, the less productive they're going to be. You could completely secure every system in your organization by simply disconnecting your connection to the internet and turning off all of your servers. However, this has a pretty negative impact on overall productivity levels, as you might imagine. So there's always a need to balance security with usability, and that's a fine line sometimes, and some organizations are necessarily going to be more inclined to take security measures over productivity measures, especially those in heavily regulated industries. GlobalMantics intends to protect itself against one, known malware and phishing sites, and this is the issue of external threats. They want to make sure that any sites that knowingly house malware are blocked from users at GlobalMantics. And they also want to protect themselves from a wasteful activity of users potentially browsing adult-oriented sites. So that's the two things that GlobalMantics is primarily interested in with regard to URL filtering in Threat Management Gateway. Threat Management Gateway's URL filtering license is actually separate from the overall Forefront license, and it's part of what's called the Threat Management Gateway Web Protection Services umbrella, which includes URL filtering and anti-malware or enhanced malware protection. This is a separate web protection license that you have to acquire outside the initial license that you get for Threat Management Gateway. The licensing process can be somewhat confusing, so make sure you take a look at the link that's on your screen that will explain licensing in a little bit more detail. You may already know that Threat Management Gateway comes with an evaluation web protection license, which we activated earlier in this course. Make sure that you leave plenty of time to make sure your evaluation license doesn't expire. I have read some stories of people having significant issues getting web protection licenses in time, especially in a working state, and then it creates problems for them with their Threat Management Gateway system. So make sure that you don't wait till the last day before your Threat Management Gateway Web Protection Services license expires before trying to procure your permanent license. Start that process early and to procure your permanent license. Start that process early. So how does URL filtering actually work? Well, we briefly discussed URL filtering earlier in this course, but we're going to go over it in a little bit more detail. First of all, when a user submits a browsing request, Threat Management Gateway queries a cloud-based service called the Microsoft Reputation Service. So a user provides a URL that they want to visit. Threat Management Gateway takes a look at that URL and submits it in its whole, in its entirety, to the Microsoft Reputation Service. This is a database that's updated as often as every 20 minutes. And the way it works is every URL is categorized, and then these results are returned to the Threat Management Gateway system. Because users tend to browse things over and over, for improved performance, these results are cached both locally and persistently. And what I mean by persistently is that the cache will survive a reboot. However, the cache results are subjected to a time to live, just like DNS. After all, a web URL can change categories. For example, suppose you are visiting a site and then tomorrow it got affected by malware. It may end up being a malware-oriented site at some point in the future, and Microsoft will update the category for that URL based on new needs. There are a number of data sources for the Microsoft Reputation Service. First of all, there's internal Microsoft data sources that they use to keep the database current, as well as a service called Bright Cloud and M86 Security. And you can extend this service transparently on your own by providing feedback to Microsoft directly. And we'll be doing that a little bit later on in this lesson. I mentioned before that the entire URL is sent off to the Microsoft Reputation Service. Categorization is actually based on the full path that the user uses. So, www.globalmantics.com/gambling could be categorized as a gambling site. www.globalmantics.com/malware could be categorized as a malware site. And the general www.globalmantics.com could be categorized as a general business site. So just because a overall domain URL carries a significant or a particular categorization, don't think that every time that one of your users visits any link on that site that it's going to carry the same categorization. It can change depending on what's being housed in particular locations on the site. A single URL in Threat Management Gateway and in the Microsoft Reputation Service can be included in multiple categories, and there's a precedence to how these categories are going to be prioritized. The link on your screen outlines the precedence that's going to take place, and this is how the URL filtering is going to work. So if a rule hits a particular URL filter and there's a URL that's in multiple categories, it'll hit the first category first by precedence that's outlined on the link on your screen. So understand that precedence can take place, and it will take place for URLs that have multiple categories. The URL will actually be slotted into the category that takes precedence overall, although it'll still end up being in multiple categories. For Threat Management Gateway, it'll show you both categories, but from a precedence perspective, the first one on the precedence list is the one that you're going to really be paying attention to. The Microsoft Reputation Service categorizes URLs for you, and if you find a mistake, you can submit a report by using the link on your screen. And let's go take a look at that right now. Here we are at the website for the Microsoft Reputation Service, and you can look up any URL you want. So let's look up www.trainsignal.com and click Get Categories. And as we scroll down, you're going to see that trainsignal.com is actually slotted into two categories: general business and education or reference. And that makes sense because TrainSignal is a business, and second, we sell training products or educational products. So therefore, we're going to get multiple categorizations. If, however, we believe that when we're visiting this site that this really belongs in a different category, we can choose which categories we believe it belongs in. Alcohol? I don't really think so. Criminal activities? I obviously doubt it. And all kinds of other categories. As you can see, there are a number of different categories from which you can choose. You can choose up to 5 categories. If you want to tell Microsoft that there are potentially 5 other categories that this URL should be slotted into, then you can indicate that here. If you own the URL, you can select this checkbox and provide your contact information, including your name and your email address, as well as any comments you want Microsoft to review when they take a look at this particular reputation service request. And then we have your normal unreadable image that you have to try to read and interpret, and then you click Submit Report. Now, it doesn't mean that Microsoft is going to immediately take action and do something about your request. After all, if you tried to place one of your competitors' URLs into a prohibited category, Microsoft wants to prevent that kind of fraud from taking place. So they're going to review this, and if they think that it's reasonable, they may make a category change or addition. But on the other hand, they could just reject your request because it looks like it could be illegitimate or something more malicious than good. I'm now going to go over to the Global Mantic's Threat Management Gateway server, and I'm going to show you how you can look up URL categories for yourself. Here we are on the Threat Management Gateway server, and I have Web Access Policy selected. I'll choose Configure URL Filtering. And from there, you'll notice, first of all, that URL filtering is enabled. And I'll go to the category query, and I'll type www.trainsignal.com, just like we did at the Microsoft Reputation Service page. And click Query. And you'll see that it comes back with two categories, Education Reference and General Business, with the primary category for TrainSignal being Education and Reference. And you can see the description here says it's categorized by Microsoft Reputation Service. So that gives me a way to quickly and easily, from the Threat Management Gateway server, be able to determine in which category a particular URL will be found, and also understand the primary category for every URL. Further, I can see the license details for URL filtering that we've discussed, so you can see what license is in place right now for the URL filtering service. Right now, you can see that I have both malware inspection and URL filtering enabled under an evaluation license that expires on September 8th, 2011. At this point, I'm going to go over to the Global Mantic's Threat Management Gateway system, and we're going to create a server-level global override for www.ibm.com, and we're going to classify it as a malicious site. Now, ibm.com is obviously not a malicious site, but it'll let you see exactly what happens when you override a URL categorization. So let's start by making sure we can browse to ibm.com. We'll do this from the Threat Management Gateway server. And it works just like you would expect. Now, I'm going to go into the URL categories. I will give you a hint. I've already set up this override, but I'm going to click on Configure URL Category Overrides. And you can see that I've clicked the Add button and provided a URL pattern of star.ibm.com/star. So anything that browses to ibm.com anywhere on the site will be categorized as malicious to systems that are affected by the rule. And I'll open it so you can see exactly what that looks like. So here's the open URL category override string that I've provided. And I've said that this is going to be a malicious content category. Okay? Now I'll go over to a Windows 7 system. And I'm going to try to browse to www.ibm.com. And you'll see that access is denied based on the fact that Threat Management Gateway denied the URL. So that gives you some information for the user about a URL that's been blocked. Now the user can then bring this information to you and say, what's going on? I need to go to ibm.com. And then you can say, what's going on? I need to go to ibm.com. And then you can, based on rules that you define. One of the great things about the URL filtering service is you don't have to actually rely on everything Microsoft tells you. Global Mantic can, if they like, override the URL filtering category settings that are in Threat Management Gateway. You can create an override at the Threat Management server level itself, or you can allow users to actually override URL categorizations and then report on those overrides later on so that you can see if people are complying with corporate policy. By the process that you would start with is to enable the ability for a user to override a rule. From there, you would define for how long that override is effective. But once the user closes their browser, regardless of how long that override is effective, the override is over because it's session specific. From a limitations perspective, this has to be enabled on a per rule basis, this per rule user override. And only HTTP connections are supported. If you want to support HTTPS connections with a URL override on a user perspective, you have to create two deny rules, one for HTTP and one for HTTPS. Global Mantic is interested only right now in HTTP, We'll be working with HTTPS information elsewhere in this course. So you got to see that IBM was blocked, but how would you allow a user to actually override that blocking? Well, there's a way to do it, and we're going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway server once again and take a look at how we enable overrides on a particular rule. Now, your first instinct might be to go to this allow rule and try to figure out a way that you would allow users to be able to browse to IBM.com or override a particular denial. Well, if you go to the Properties in the Actions tab, you're going to notice that the User Override option is grayed out. The reason is because you can't do an override on an allow rule. An allow rule, by its very nature, allows things. So denying an allow doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Instead, you've got to make an allowance on a deny rule. And in this case, you'll notice that we've got a pretty significant set of denials going on here. We're disabling access to anonymizers, botnets, criminal activity pages, gambling, hate sites, a whole bunch of stuff. By enabling users to override these URL categorizations, we're going to allow them to override URL categorizations for any of these categories. So let's take a look at this rule and see what that actually means. Right now, we've got a whole bunch of stuff that we're denying them access to, including spyware and adware sites, pornography, phishing, obscene, malicious sites, illegal drugs, all kinds of bad stuff. Notice that malicious sites sits here, and that's where we placed IBM. Now, we're not going to create an exception here for IBM because we want to allow users to do it on their own. So let's cancel this wizard. And what we're going to do is we're going to remove malicious from this list. So we'll just remove malicious. And then I'm going to copy this rule and paste it. And I'll then choose the second rule. It's a little hard to see because of the screen, but there are two rules here that are identical right now. I've got the second one selected, and I'll go to the to page here, and I'm just going to remove all of these items. And we'll add just malicious to there. So we have a rule that's just going to block access to malicious sites. Now what's going to happen is forefront traffic will now go through this rule and it will get blocked, and then hit this rule and it'll get blocked, and then it'll hit an allow rule. So basically right now the exact same thing is going to happen, and I'm going to apply these changes. I'm going to go out and show you that the exact same thing happens. So we're on our desktop now, and you'll notice that when I go to IBM.com, I get the same error message that I got before. Even if I refresh the page, it pretty much doesn't matter what I do, I still get the same denial. So that's a good thing, because it shows that our rules are still working. Back over on the Threat Management Gateway server, I'm now going to right-click this deny rule and choose Properties. The first thing I've got to do is get rid of HTTPS, because we can't use HTTPS with an override, as I mentioned before. So we'll remove that. And then we'll go to the Action tab, and we're going to allow a user override, and we'll allow it to override for 30 minutes. So basically the user would be able to browse for 30 minutes, and at that point then they would have to override the URL again if they close their browser. So then we'll do apply and OK, and then we'll apply the configuration change. I'm now going to go over to the Windows 7 desktop, and we're going to see what behavior change we're seeing as a result of the ability for the user to be able to override access to malicious sites. So you see here that we had the denial from before. This time, if I try to go to IBM, you're going to notice that things have changed a little bit. This time it's telling me that the access has been blocked, and it's because it's categorized as malicious. But if I consider this site to be categorized incorrectly, which obviously it is because this is IBM, right? Or you're receiving this message by mistake, you can contact the help desk, but in the meantime, you can actually do some work. Now, it also tells the user you can access this website by clicking the button below, but your access will be logged. So we'll click Override Access Restriction, And now the user is able to browse to ibm.com and everything works as expected for the user, and they're able to be productive. But like I said before, the access will be logged. We talk about reporting and logging in the reporting and logging lesson in this course, so I'm not going to go over that again in this lesson. However, for customizing user experience and managing the denial notification, I want to show you where you can do that in the Threat Management Gateway console, because it can take a little bit of digging to find it. So we're going to go over to the Threat Management Gateway console, and we're going to create a custom denial message for the IBM rule that we've been working with. And you can see here that I've got my denial rule, the one that we created here for just malicious sites, selected. And you'll notice that I'm on the Action tab. We're going to deny, and we're going to allow user override, and we'll click Advanced. Notice here we have a couple of additional items. One is to display the denial notification to a user, which is what we're going to do. And the GlobalMantic has deemed this site bad. You can also create your own HTML page with your own HTML code, the whole 9 yards if you like, and then link to it from here. But we're not going to do that here. So we'll click OK, and OK again, and we'll apply the changes. And we'll click OK, because we now applied our changes and the firewall's reconfigured. Now, I'm going to go over to the Windows 7 machine, and we're going to see what happens. I had to refresh the page because that was cached. But this time, you'll see that the explanation is GlobalMantic has deemed this site bad. So you can actually customize on a per rule basis exactly what you want to say to the user. And that can be kind of nice because it can help you reduce calls to the service desk by providing some instruction in that area if you like. But what if you want to exempt specific people from a rule? That's next up in the Threat Management Gateway console. Now the first rule you see here is the one that has the deny. And this is where we can modify the rule and we can create some exceptions so that people are not necessarily caught by this rule. So we'll right click the rule and we'll choose Properties. And over here on the right hand side of the screen you'll see a Users tab. Right now this request applies to all users, but we can add exceptions. So if we add a new user, we'll call it administrators. And we're going to add another user to the administrators group. We're going to add a Windows user from the entire directory. And it's going to be domain admins. And we'll do next and finish. So we just created an exception or a group for administrators at GlobalMantic. And we could add anybody we wanted if we want to add management or the marketing department or whoever to a group just like this. And then we'll click Add and Close, and you'll see that administrators are now exempted from this rule. So what is the effect? Well, let's go out and find out. You'll notice that we changed it here, so all users and administrators, but administrators has a little hash through it. So we'll apply the rule, or the changes, and then we'll go back over to our Windows 7 machine and see what the effect is. I had to refresh the page. I'm now allowed to go to gambling.com. And the reason I can't go to IBM.com is because that's still categorized as a malicious site. Remember, earlier on we removed the malicious site entry from that first rule. So even though I'm an administrator, I still can't go to IBM.com without having to choose the override option because that first rule does not capture IBM.com. But I can go to any of the other sites that are listed in that first rule. And that's pretty cool. But I'm going to go over and remove that exemption. In fact, I can right-click right here and choose Remove. And Administrators is now removed from that rule without having to open up the rule properties. That's just a shortcut. Click Apply. And again, we can type a change description and click Apply here. And now when I go over to the Windows 7 machine, I will no longer have access to gambling.com. It takes a second for Threat Management Gateway to actually catch up. So sometimes if you're in a hurry, like I am sometimes, it can take 30, 40 seconds for everything to catch up. So that's why it allowed me in for a couple of minutes. And don't forget, websites are cached locally as well. So you may have to refresh your page in order to be able to see the denial message immediately. If you enable the ability for users to override basically policies that have been designed at the corporate level, you probably want to be able to see when users have decided to violate or go around this policy. And you can actually see overrides take place in the Threat Management Gateway logs. You can also view override activity in Threat Management Gateway reports. And you can create a regular report that's sent out to management to report on overrides that have taken place. You can also customize the user experience with regard to URL filtering. You can manage the denial notification, and you can add URL filtering. You can manage URL. Basically, you can create your own page that users will see rather than the default Threat Management Gateway denial page. And in some cases, you want to exempt specific users or computers from URL filtering. You can do this by modifying an existing rule or creating a specific allow rule. So basically what I'm saying is you can modify an existing rule to allow particular users or computers to be exempted from URL filtering, or you can create an allow rule that's above your default rule that enables this access. Now, why would you want to actually exempt users or computers from URL filtering? Well, you may actually have a research department, as GlobalMantics does, and you don't want to limit their ability to do business intelligence and scan the market. Now, that might mean that they're out on adult sites or something along those lines. And you also want your marketing department to be able to be out there to see what's being said about GlobalMantics. So you may allow marketing or research or IT, who has to enforce the policy, to be able to look at whatever they need to ensure that others are applying with corporate policy, or that people are able to do their jobs. For example, marketing wants to see if bad things are being said about GlobalMantics on message boards or sites that might be blocked by filtering policies. We just modified an existing rule, and you got to see one downside, particularly if you want a wide swath of users to be exempted from some of your policies. You have to be careful about how the rules are configured. You got to see that administrators still could not go to IBM.com because of the fact that there was a malicious site categorization in Threat Management Gateway. So you would actually have to modify all of the rules that would be captured, that would capture that user, and add the administrators as an exemption. Or you can create a specific allow rule for the users that you want. And we're going to go over it, and we're going to do that right now. So we'll choose Create Access Rule, and we're going to call this All Admins. And we're going to allow all admins whatever they want to do. HTTP, HTTPS. Next. We won't worry about malware inspection right now. It's going to apply to traffic from the internal network. And to the external networks. And click Next. This rule will apply only to the administrative users that we created before. So only domain admins, in this case, will have access to this rule. Everyone else will flow down through subordinate rules later on. And click Next, and Finish. What we've just done is the first rule now allows all administrators to do whatever the heck they want. So we'll click Apply, and we'll apply the changes to Threat Management Gateway. And this time I'll be a little bit patient before I go over to our Windows 7 machine on which I'm logged in as administrator. And we'll go over and see what we can do. And now you see that I have unfettered access to the internet. I'm not even being told that I have to override a rule because Threat Management Gateway is never making it that far. That first rule captures me because I'm logged in as an administrator, and I'm able to just flow out to the internet and do whatever I want. Now let's see how to enable Safe Search integration in the Threat Management Gateway console. And here we are once again in the console at the Web Access Policy area, and you'll see an item here for Configure Safe Search. So I'll click it, and it's pretty easy. you choose Enable Safe Search. As is the case with other rules, you can choose if you want to exclude particular users from Safe Search, but we don't want to do that. So this basically will filter adult content, and I click OK, and then once I click Apply, you'll notice that it becomes the first rule in the system, although you can move it around if you like. But all users are then subjected to Safe Search by the Safe Search rule. If you use Bing, Microsoft's search engine, you'll notice that they have different levels of detail that can be brought back in search results by using what's called Safe Search. And there's 3 different levels. You can set in your browser what level of Safe Search you want to use. And you can also do this when you go to, like I said, Bing search engine, or even Google has this kind of capability. By enforcing the Safe Search be used, you can require URL filtering to be enabled. What actually happens is, regardless of what the user has selected on his or her PC or in their web browsing session, search engines are forced to treat the request as a Safe Search request and return filtered results based on what you specify as a corporate policy. Threat Management Gateway will actually automatically modify users' query strings to make sure that they go through Safe Search. And regardless of browser settings, users cannot retrieve unfiltered content. If you are using the HTTPS inspection feature of Threat Management Gateway, Safe Search is enforced even with HTTPS sessions, because Threat Management Gateway is able to see inside the encrypted traffic when that feature is enabled. So it's actually able to enforce Safe Search even with HTTPS sessions enabled. We started this lesson with a discussion about why it's important to link Threat Management Gateway to corporate policy and compliance needs. From there, we moved on to discuss URL filtering licensing considerations so that you would understand, and GlobalMantics would understand, that URL filtering is achieved through an additive license to Threat Management Gateway. Next, we discussed how URL filtering actually operates. Next, we discussed how your existing URL filters on the Threat Management Gateway server. From there, you discovered how to manage URL filtering settings, and we wrapped up the lesson with a discussion about enabling Safe Search integration on the Threat Management Gateway server. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.